So a couple of disclaimers before I go into this. This is collective work. I do speak on behalf of primarily students who have done this work, so I'm grateful for what they have brought to the archives. I'm going to focus on India because that's the space that I know in the assertions that I make. And this is, of course, work in progress, and I'm looking really primarily for feedback, especially from this audience and from our panel. So thanks again to the SUV, to our hosts, and to Lisa for this session. I'm at the archives at NCPS, which is a public collecting center for the history of science in contemporary India. We're based in Bangalore in the south. The traffic is bad. The weather is great. This is our front door entrance, and we just sort of populated that with the word of the archive in various languages that are written in the country. And most students who come and look at this are a little surprised because they don't know the word of the archive in the language that they speak. This is just our front page. We're a very small archive and a very new one, about 4.5 years old, as I mentioned the other day. So you can have a look at our website and such. But I'm here to really talk about what I think is our situation. When I start a class, or when I start amongst a set of new students, I usually ask them, how many of you have been to a library? And usually most of the hands go up. And then I switch, how many of you have been to a museum? And most of the hands stay up. And I ask gallery, and people are not sure, and some go down. And then I say archive, and I did this a couple of months ago. And 4 hands sort of remained up in the audience. And to be honest, I think that was 3 more than what I expected. And I don't think this is unusual. I'm not sure how it is in your societies and in your environments, but I would say that if I had to do the same test, like a straw poll test outside the National Archives of India, and I asked how many people have visited an archive, my guess is most people would have never even heard of the word, let alone visit an archive. I don't know what it is on the streets of Dublin or Johannesburg or any of the other cities that all of us are from. But my hunch is that most people are probably familiar with, when you ask them about an archive, they will say, yeah, of course, I know what an archive is, and they'll start talking about Google and Dropbox and WhatsApp and emails and so on and so forth. And there's a certain way in which we talk about the archive as a verb. But the moment we switch to sort of pin them down and ask them about the archive as a noun, the digital physical archives that all of us are in some senses involved with, most of our audiences, at least in India, are probably going to look back at us and say, what? And so this is sort of the environment that we're in. And unfortunately, though, of course, it's all of them have visited an archive in some ways, or all of them are in possession of something that has the potential of becoming the record that can become, as we know. And so there is this sort of framework that we have to build in our society to sort of let people know that the archive is everywhere, if only you were to look for it. And so that's sort of the environment that we're based in. And so I feel very strongly that archives are, of course, sites of knowledge. They're sites that can be used for research and such. But we think we can do a little bit more and really rethink the archive as a site that teaches you how to know, and a site that really sort of brings together this idea of empathy, enchantment, and education. And that's really the focus of this conversation today. So I do think there's a strong need, at least in India, for archivists as educators, as being front and center for what they do, besides their work as archivists, of course. I realize it's an additional job, but if we don't do this, we are not really responding to who I think as being future custodians. So I was looking back at this paper from Ken Osborne, many of you are familiar with it, called Archives in the Classroom, from about 1986, where he discusses Bolotenko's paper, Archivists and Historians, Keepers of the Well, and he talks about how this sparked a considerable debate on the role and identity of archivists, and about 2 positions, the archivist as a records manager and archives as a historian, and he talks about the neglect of the third, the archivist as educator. 40 years on, I think it's aging quite well, at least in India. So there is a certain need for us to prioritize the public in archives effectively. I mean, archives that are public institutions, which are the ones that we inhabit. We don't really focus on the word public as much as I think we need to. Here's another quote from a paper in 1977 from Howard Applegate, Richard Brown, and Elsie Fry-Vogel, which I think is aging even better, which says, if a public institution does not build constituencies larger than those of the academic researcher, the institution is doomed. I realize I'm being a little provocative when I say these, but we desperately need this focus in India, at least, to look at public institutions that really reach out beyond the academic researcher, because otherwise we run the risk of these institutions becoming irrelevant for a larger cross-section of the society, which really is the custodian, the donor, the benefactor, the funder of the archive, these public spaces. So that's the basis for which we sort of reimagining the 4 verticals of the archive that we run. Of course, the work on the left is what we do primarily: finding, arranging, telling, preserving, sharing. But then, of course, we do research, we engage with the public. But the 4th is what I'm focusing on today, which is to sort of really think of the archive as a site that educates and builds capacity in some broader sense of that word. And as I've said before, we think archives exist primarily to enable a diversity of stories and a gospel that we keep sort of feeding to students who come, and hopefully they catch on to that. So, and of course, all of these are interlinked. So, part 2, a response to what I think is our situation. One is predictably an internship program. But not so predictably perhaps, the background of the students who come in. So over the last 5 years, we've had, I would say, quite a bit of luck in having about 55 students from a little over a dozen different disciplines, anywhere between high school to postdoctoral students, who come and just engage with the idea of the archive. So we're not expecting them to become archivists. We can't do that in the 2 to 6 month time frame that they're with us. But we want to build a sensibility of the archive. We want them to go back broadly knowing about the nature, the form, the content of archives in some way, beyond their Google photos. These are paid internships, and they come, as I said, anywhere between 2 and 6 months. So the process, how do they apply? They come from all over the country. We've actually had 2 students now from other countries. There's 1 student coming this summer. I can't remember from where, from somewhere in the UK. I'm sorry, I'm no longer taking charge of the internship program. But the process is one where they have to find it. It's a self-selecting group. We don't advertise it too much, so it works better for us this way. They have to find their way to the archive in some measure. There's a questionnaire that they have to fill up. If there's a good fit, we have conversation with them. We try and frame a project to see if it's going to work out, and then we start. Here's an example from the questionnaire. We have about 10 questions that we put out. It's, and this is like any other archival object. It's a letter. We sort of deliberately, strip it of all context. I was smiling from the image that we saw from FinRFI the other day. And we sort of just put it out there to see how students respond to it in terms of archival description. It's fairly dense. So what we're looking for from students is to see if you have no experience, no context to archives, how do you go about archival description? What are the things that you pull out? What are the clues that you see in it? How do you connect the dots? Those are the kinds of things that we just sort of, and we have a conversation around that during the interview after that. I'm happy to share the citation. So the most common internship, of course, is archival arrangement and description, which is, I would say, the bulk of the students who come and work with us. And of course, some of them are interns who spend and thankfully like it enough that they actually want to work with us for a few months. Or for a year or 2 years, and they become short-term project employees who are attached to a particular collection that we are processing, and we put them on a higher pay grade, and it's really nice because they eventually become trainers of the new interns who come along. So that's been a lot of fun to sort of see that evolution of the student within a span of 2 years, because they're so invested in the idea of the archive now, coming from a space of having no sense of the word. But really, this is sort of what my friends call the cool interns. In other words, the ones who are actually not there doing the archiving, but they're just having fun in the archive. But the way I'd like to describe this one is really say that once we find a good fit, what we're looking for is a way to just simply wrap the archive around their interest. We don't care what your interest is. If we think it's a good fit, whether you're a designer or a journalist or an engineer, we just try and wrap the archive around your interest. And this is part of our sort of desperate attempt to just try and constantly get the archive out to the public, to sort of emphasize the word public. We've had engineering students who've rebuilt historic scientific equipment. We've had a student of law write a paper on what happens when archival material goes public. We've had a design student in the early days of the archive imagining what an archival space should look like. She was given a brief about how do you bring inclusivity and warmth into an archival space. She was an architecture student. So it was whoever they are, whatever their background is, and they typically work with an external mentor because we're not trained in those disciplines. So it becomes a three-party sort of 3-person project usually for these students. I'll just walk us through a few of these projects. This is a Google Arts and Culture project that happened this was one of the first things that happened about 5 years ago. This was an illustration intern whose brief was to try and redesign what a planned view of an archive should look like. how do you sort of build something that can communicate to the public about what an archive is and what it does? And this is our archive. It's a small little space, but she sort of reimagined. I was really sort of happy with her work. This is our first first solo exhibition or installation by a student who had just graduated, and her brief was to look at the stuff that we don't include in the archive. So there was the stuff that was not appraised. So she sort of had to wade through what we didn't appraise and try and develop an exhibition around that. And this was an exhibition that happened for about a month and a half in 2019. This is a student who is a still life painter. He's actually a faculty somewhere in the United States now. This was quite somber because this was really still life, because soon after he started, the lockdowns kicked in for the pandemic. So, in a sense, I think his paintings are also going to age quite well in the decades to come, because he captured campus in the first week of the lockdown through his paintings. This is one of my favorites, Megha Jayaraj, who in early 21, again, still sort of in the peak of the lockdowns, is a textile artist who worked on an exhibition called Mother, Take Good Care of Me at a time when there was so much sort of separation between individuals, and she was trying to figure out desperately how to sort of dig into her own archives, her own memories, and try and figure out how to bring those aspects front and center while she waded through the material that her co-intern, an archival arrangement intern, was processing someone else's paper. She would sort of shadow this other student and see what is coming from this and how can it speak to her own art form and her own work. So she would carry a suitcase around campus because we're not allowed to have proximity, and she would just invite people to come and sit next to her and walk through her artistic practice and walk through her sort of stories as she tries to develop these ideas of what it means to remember, what it means to sort of make what is the past into the present, what is today becoming tomorrow. And that's what she says, the fragments collected in the box aspire a certain consciousness about remembrance, and in today preparing for tomorrow. She's just an extraordinary artist, and we're very grateful that she chose to work with us in the archive. And in a sense, she's built a sensibility of the archive in her practice now going forward. A few more, Sanjana Girish. Sanjana Yechireddy is an anthropologist in training now, who worked with us for about 2 years, and also happens to be a poet. She is many different people in one. She did this project called Experiments with Loss. Anima is a space design and an installation artist who worked on the collections of an ornithologist and sort of developed this beautiful piece of work on the right-hand side. And Manish and Sanjana at the bottom worked on a short play using material from the collections of a neurobiologist named Veronica Rodriguez. So it's this constant sort of throwing stuff on the wall and seeing what sticks. Once we find the right student, we just say, let's wrap the archive around what you do. That's kind of what we're doing here. And sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. I'm obviously sharing the ones that worked. This is just a shout out to all the students most of the names that you see here are students who've been involved with us over the last 5 years or so. So part 2 is looking at, we thought I'll sort of extend this idea a little further and think about an archive course. This course is titled Us in the World, Archive Stories in the Lives of Others. Yes, the title has a clickbaity nature to it, and I'm glad to say it worked. All right, 10% of the students signed up for the course because they like the title, and that matters. This is a course, it's for master's students in development, public policy, and education at Azim Premji University, which is another institute in Bangalore. And I've given this, I guess I've offered this course for 2 years now. I just finished the session a couple of weeks ago. And the intent is very simple. It is to see everything's archive and the archive in everything, which is to say that these are not students who are going to be trained to be archivists. They're not being trained to use the archive. They're just being trained to be sensitized about the archive. They're going to be, civil servants. They're going to be in governance. They're going to be in education. They're going to be in other disciplines entirely. The course sort of looks at archives and governance. It looks at how to navigate archival sources. We have a really fun project on developing a fictitious archive. And we try and sort of sensitize them around seeing the connections between archives and the stories that emerge from archives. But our hope really is that they start to see the archive everywhere they go. It's like, the mind being stretched by a new idea, et cetera, sort of thing. That they start to see the archive as a living, breathing idea that can strengthen the civic and digital commons that all of us inhabit. It's a 12-week course, 2 hours once a week. So I guess it's 24 hours of total class time, including discussions and such. We have about its front-loaded theoretical structure. As you can see, it's a super 30,000 feet overview. Building archives in 2 classes, we are done. Ethics in another class, technology in another class, education 1 class. But the point is, it just gives them a flavor of different aspects of the archive. We have a couple of field visits, and the second half of the class is focused on doing discussions, class projects, and sort of getting feedback from them as they work. And so I'll just talk a little bit about the 2 assignments that they do. One is an assignment which is a questionnaire where broadly I'm trying to see, do you see the archive in everything? That's sort of the intent of this assignment. It's about 15 questions. They have to do it at home. They can do whatever. They can open a book, the web, ChatGPT. They can talk to their friends, do whatever they want. And they get 2 weeks to do this. And the second one is a fictitious archive, a group project where they have to do in-class presentations. And the intent here is take something, build an archive around it. Take an idea, build an archive around it is the intent. Here's an example from the questionnaire. The broad question here is looking at, basically sort of a future-looking situation where I'm looking at the WhatsApp records of a very famous chess player. Anand is a very famous chess player, and I'm basically posing the question to them to say, what are you going to do in the year 2063, preparing for the researcher who's going to come in the year 2100, around this thing called WhatsApp, stored on a thing called a smartphone without a cable called a USB cable. And just to see how they think about this question. I'm not expecting them to have answers, because if they do, they really should be taking over our jobs. But the students, many of them said that they use ChatGPT, so I was just getting curious. So I signed up on ChatGPT to just run the whole questionnaire on that. ChatGPT is being very clever. It offers this extremely sophisticated non-answer. You'd notice that it uses the same words that are in the question. But I mean, it's fine. I shouldn't be so harsh on ChatGPT. It's fine. I guess it's doing what I would do at this stage. But I was hoping for a crystal ball approach here. I was asking for too much of the software. But in any case, I do have a bone to pick, because apparently it doesn't know that we exist. So so there's that. Anyway, the assignment 2 is a fictitious archive, where we sort of ask. It's fictitious. It can be anything, anywhere. It doesn't have to be real. I tell them that they don't need anything but a pen and a paper and their minds and probably their colleagues. They don't need the internet. But what they do need is they have to adhere to the questions that are laid out. In other words, they have to be faithful to the idea of the archive. So they have to walk through questions of the archive, because many people who come to us very often are very clued into the idea of a story, but not so much the idea of an archive. And so part of our project is really to make them distinguish between a museum, a collection, a story, a library, these sort of different things that have intersections, but they have some slight separations. So they have to wade through these questions. Again, they may not have answers to them, but if they're wading through the questions, our job is done. They've at least thought through these points, and they may say, I don't know, and that's okay. Here are a bunch of fun archives they came up with. My favorite one at this point is the Lost Gods Archive, which is preserving cultural diversity of the Jari region. It does not exist. It's just something that's just made up. Or the other one just above it, Pyarelal University, does not exist. A protest between students and aliens in the year 1975 did not happen, to the best of my knowledge. The point is not so much the content is irrelevant for us. It's really how they construct an archive around whatever content they come up with. So it's been a lot of fun to work with them in these projects. So just to recap, the intent here in both these experiments has been to build a sensibility of the archive, knowing fully well that they will be one of these in the future. They might be a creator, they might be a steward, they might be a donor, they might be an archivist. I hope some of them are funders. There might be a user or an audience, but this is what they are. How are we doing the time? Okay. All right. So I'll just wrap up to say that the response has been quite good, and we've had one to say that time was too short, and the other to say that that they found it useful for students of education and policy. But the students in the internships basically found it to be a really good way to enter a workforce, and for them it was a way to conduct themselves in the adult world, which we didn't expect to be a benefit from the process. And I love what the student talked about, which is being comfortable with things that are not known to you. So So I'm really hoping that we get to this point where archives are seen as a site of the commons, and for that, I think we need to really think of archives as being spaces that students inhabit. And I will wrap with a lovely book, which I hope if any of you have read this. If you haven't, I'd encourage you. It's by Rebecca Solnit, called A Field Guide to Getting Lost. And she talks about the job of the artists to open doors, and talks about how scientists transform the unknown into the known, haul it in like fishermen, and artists get you out into the dark sea. With due apologies to her, I think archivists do the same. Archivists open doors, and archivists get you out into the dark sea. So thanks so much for your time, and I apologize for the...